Nexus PMG welcomes you to the Bigger Than Us podcast, which we as energy geeks lovingly refer to as the BTU. Bigger Than Us is a podcast that focuses on ideas that will shape the future of our planet and ultimately our existence. We will occasionally lean into energy topics because, after all, it's the key to our collective survival. But we'll also explore other ideas and topics that we believe will have an impact that is bigger than us. And now, on to today's show. Hello, and welcome to the Bigger Than Us podcast. I'm your host, Raj Daniels, and today I'd like to welcome Dan Schnitzer to the show. Dan is the CEO of SparkMeter, the leading provider of smart metering systems that enable utilities to implement prepaid billing and real-time monitoring and control on microgrids and central grids alike. He has served as a consultant to the United Nations Office for Project Services in Haiti and for the World Bank. From 2014 to 2015, he was the chair of the United Nations SE4 All Practitioner Network Microgrid Working Group, and he was named to the Forbes 30 Under 30 for Energy list in 2012. Dan, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks, Raj. How are you?
Dan, I'm doing fantastic and excited to speak to you. Where are you currently located?
I'm based in Washington, D.C. And how about you?
I am in Dallas, Texas. How's the weather in Washington?
We had a beautiful 75-degree day yesterday. It's gotten a little chilly and windy since then, but still can't complain.
And is the cherry blossom season already over?
Yeah, came and went pretty early this year.
You know, we had a spring blink of an eye, and then last week we had some really chilly temperatures. Even this week it's been in the 60s, so it's interesting to watch these weather patterns.
Yeah, it certainly is. Things are certainly coming into bloom right now. It's been delightful seeing the leaves budding on the trees over the last few weeks, and so we're getting to full bloom across everything here.
Well, it sounds lovely. So, Dan, I like to open the show by asking my guest the following question. If you were asked to share something interesting about yourself, what would it be?
Something interesting. I guess it's quite possibly that if it hadn't been for my interest in energy, which I really got into energy and environmental policy as a result of my eighth grade science fair project. So I've been an energy nerd for over 20 years. I probably would have ended up going to culinary school. I was seriously contemplating in college becoming a chef as a career, and I worked my senior year at a French restaurant in Chicago called La Petite Folie, and had a great time, and I learned a ton. And one of the things that I learned was that maybe the lifestyle of being a chef wasn't quite something I wanted to sign up for, but was still something that I would maintain as a passionate hobby.
So, I guess food is also some kind of energy, right?
It certainly is. Yeah, as a great class that I took in college was called The Hungry Planet, which is all about the different transfers and transformations of energy, including in our food system.
And what was your eighth grade project?
My eighth grade science fair project, I fermented apple peels, and then I made a stovetop still using my grandma's pressure cooker, some plastic tubing, and a coffee can. And I triple distilled my fermented mash of apple peels into pure ethanol, or nearly pure ethanol. And then I burned my ethanol in a kerosene lamp, and I compared it to a couple of fossil fuels, including kerosene. And I something clicked where I saw that my homemade fuel created this flame, created energy just as well as these industrial fossil fuels. And I knew at that time, that fossil fuels were problematic, and things about the way that we produced and consumed our energy were bad for the planet, were harmful to human health, and that there was some intrinsic problems with our systems of energy. And so there was just something that clicked, and I had this realization of, wait a minute, I'm a child, and I just made this perfectly good fuel out of apple peels, which could be considered a waste product of some process. So this is what I maybe want to spend my life working on.
That is amazing. And for a moment there, I thought you were going to go in another direction when you mentioned the still, but then I realized that you weren't interviewing me, and I won't share my story about making homemade wine and then drinking it.
Well, yeah, I would be interested in hearing about that sometime.
Around the same age, I think I was, 12, 13, 14 years old. One of our science teachers decided to teach us how to make homemade wine. And so I grew up in London. We had this perfect Harry Potter closet under the stairs,
Uh,
dark and damp, and made the homemade wine. My parents didn't know. I put it under there, I think, for a week or two, fermented. And they didn't even know I drank it at the time. But it caused a terrible headache, let me tell you that.
wow. Okay, so you did the fermentation into wine, but you didn't then distill it into brandy.
Yeah, I was just looking to drink it.
Got it.
Well, it's an interesting start, and it leads me to my next question regarding SparkMeter. Can you give the audience an overview of SparkMeter and your role at the organization?
Sure. Yes, I'm one of the co-founders, and I'm the CEO. And SparkMeter is a company that sells smart electricity meters and software to utilities in developing countries and emerging markets. And basically, the way that we got started, which would you like me to get into kind of the origin story of SparkMeter, or more what we do?
I would love to hear the origin story.
Okay, so it goes back to when I was working in Haiti. So I started a nonprofit organization called EarthSpark International about 10 years ago, or I guess more than that now. And EarthSpark was founded to really work on energy access, and providing models, financial tools for people to be able to get access to solar home systems and solar powered lamps. And we then had the opportunity to work with a town called Les Anglais to build a full microgrid. So the electricity infrastructure in Haiti, like in many developing countries, especially those in sub-Saharan Africa, have very limited infrastructure when it comes to the electrical, the power system infrastructure. Doesn't really exist outside of the largest cities. So there are dozens of towns in Haiti that have no electrical infrastructure whatsoever. And so we had the opportunity to work with this town to set up a microgrid and essentially put in poles and wires and build a solar generation system to provide the entire town with 24-hour clean electricity from a solar generation system. And so we were able to secure some funding from donors, including USAID and National Geographic. And we built the first solar powered microgrid in Haiti. And this was now several years ago. And we worked very closely with the government of Haiti on putting in the right policy and regulatory framework to enable us to do that legally, or at least give the right level of visibility to the government. And I think that's something I'm particularly proud of us doing, and is something that I've seen many failed quote unquote development projects in developing countries where some people with good intentions go to a village or to a town with people who have dire needs, and then they just kind of go in and they put in a project and then they leave, and then within a year or two, or maybe longer, at some point the project fails. I know I'm kind of going on a tangent here, but this idea of participatory development, so this idea of bringing in people as stakeholders, the beneficiaries as stakeholders, to design the project and design the program, and then to also bring in the government and make sure that you're working within the policy and regulatory framework of the government is, I think, something that is crucial and is really what separates someone from simply having good intentions to someone who actually wants to produce systemic change. And that's really what we set out to do. So we successfully built this microgrid, and along the way, my business partner, Allison Archambault, and we both had backgrounds in the U.S. electric utility sector, and realized from the get-go that for this microgrid to work, we would need a smart metering system, but that the smart meters that are used by utilities in the United States and in Western Europe really were part of this system, which is called AMI, or Advanced Metering Infrastructure, which is not designed to scale down. No provider of smart metering technology that sells to utilities in the US or Europe is going to talk to you if you're building a microgrid for 500 households. It's just not how their system works. So we set out to take our own approach to doing smart metering that's much more of an IoT, Internet of Things approach to the problem, rather than what AMI is, which is really IT, information technology. And I like to refer to AMI sometimes as a pre-iPhone technology, which it really is. And that's why you have big companies like Deloitte and Accenture and IBM that work with very large utilities that are serving hundreds of thousands or even millions of customers like PG&E and Con Ed to do these AMI smart metering projects. And obviously that model of smart metering isn't going to work if you're a utility that has a small number of customers or is serving low income customers, or where you as a utility don't really have a lot of internal IT capability and resources. And so that's why we took this different direction. And we had this realization as we were developing the technology, and that's where I brought in my co-founders, was that, oh, this actually has broader applicability beyond our little project in Haiti. And this could be something that we could spin off as its own company and actually sell this product to utilities in other parts of the world that have similar characteristics.
So, in my research, I believe I came across, I think it was a video where you mentioned meters actually being one of the hurdles for electricity providers of getting power to these small communities. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean the meters are certainly part of it, but the meters really need to serve some kind of a business function or operational function for the utility. But yeah, you certainly do need some way of being able to charge your customers for the electricity that they're using. One issue that I had come across when I was doing my research in grad school, which we ended up writing a report that the UN Foundation published several years ago on case studies and best practices of microgrids in developing countries. And one sort of poor practice that we found was that some of these microgrid operators, microgrid utilities, were simply charging their customers a fixed fee every month based on how many rooms they had in their house or how many light bulbs were in their house. And so what ends up happening is you can have two households that are right next door to each other that kind of look the same, but one might be using 10 times more electricity than the other, and yet they're receiving the same electricity bill every month because there's no way of measuring the electricity that's being used. And so you run into all sorts of challenges around how to charge your customers, and then also how to collect payment when you have that sort of model. So what then happens if you go to a customer at the end of the billing period, which might be monthly or every 3 months, and the customer says, I can't pay. Do you physically remove their connection? Do you give some sort of a grace period? And at the end of the day, what ends up happening is a lot of these microgrids end up failing because they're not able to collect enough money for them to be able to continue to operate the service. And that's the last thing that anybody wants to see happen, because now you've effectively just wasted a bunch of resources. Like, why build this microgrid to begin with if you're not able to operate it sustainably for the next 10 to 20 years? And unfortunately, that's what we found was happening in several different geographies. So the utility needs to be able to collect payments to be able to continue operating, even if it's a nonprofit, even if it's run by an NGO. And so that's really where, at a very basic level, metering, especially prepaid metering, or as we've taken to call it, pay-as-you-go metering, really helps. There's a great paper, economics paper, called The Economic Lives of the Poor by Duflo and Banerjee, that was published quite a few years ago. And Duflo, at least, and maybe also Banerjee, received the Nobel Prize in economics very recently for their work on characterizing economic livelihoods, especially among the world's poor, and the approaches that they take to that, the sort of evidence-based approaches that they take to that. And that paper, I think, does a great job of characterizing the sort of lumpiness of the income of many of the world's poor who would benefit from better energy access. And that really highlights the role of pay-as-you-go, where if during a particular time of year you're sort of in the money, maybe if you're in the agricultural sector, it's harvest season, so you have money, so you can put a bunch of money into your pay-as-you-go account, and that way you can continue to use electricity. And then in another part of the year, when you aren't as liquid and you don't have cash, you can put in less into your account, or maybe you're able to tide over from what you put in your account earlier in the year. So pay-as-you-go ends up being this extremely useful technology, or a useful principle that's enabled by technology, compared to just showing up at the person's house once a month and saying, okay, you owe me this much.
So it's a very interesting model. If I'm understanding correctly, can the consumer log into the meter using their cell phone and currently see their usage and pay over their cell phone? Is that how it works?
So they don't really have to interact with the meter at all. And I think that this is a big difference between our technology and the existing paradigm of prepaid meters that are on the market. With the prepaid meters that have been on the market now for decades, the user needs to in some way physically interact with the meter. The kind of most contemporary version of that technology is where they go to a vendor, they get a scratch card. The scratch card has a string of numbers on it called a token. And then they have to go to their meter and they have to physically punch that token into their meter to then get their usage. With our system, it's tokenless. You don't need a scratch card. You can go to a vendor and you can make a cash payment, and then the vendor can use basically the SparkMeter app on the vendor's phone, where the vendor has pre-purchased wholesale electricity credits from the utility that they can now sell at a retail markup to the retail customers. And so it's all done through the app. And then once that transaction clears, then that would hit the customer's account. And now that customer's account is just automatically wirelessly topped up. So that's one mode. Another mode is with mobile money, where if the utility itself has a mobile money account, they can do a backend integration with our software where the customer can just send a mobile money payment to the utility's mobile money account. And then once that transaction clears, that would then top up the customer's account. And now again, completely wirelessly and pretty much instantaneously, the user now is able to have credit in their account and has electricity in their meter. So it's a very we've designed the system to be as easy to use and as agnostic towards payment types as possible.
So an example of mobile money would be like M-Pesa in Kenya.
Exactly.
How did you get into the IoT world?
So this is really where we felt that we were differentiated as a technology compared to the existing paradigm of smart metering, AMI, or advanced metering infrastructure, is that we really do take more of an energy IoT approach to the technology. And I'd say that was pretty heavily informed by where I did my PhD, which was Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. And so it was through Carnegie Mellon and my graduate studies that I got connected to Anthony Rowe, who's one of our co-founders, and he's a professor of electrical computer engineering there. And we brought him in to work with us on creating a more flexible wireless mesh network system, and a system that would be more robust and resilient to areas where the power and the internet is intermittent and low bandwidth. Obviously on the internet being low bandwidth. The IT systems that AMI is predicated on, and this sort of pre iPhone technology, is where you essentially have a flawless IT implementation. That's why your utility has an IT department. You have contractors from Deloitte or from Accenture, from other IT contracting firms. You have a whole ecosystem of vendors. You've got Dell providing you, or HP providing you with hardware. You've got Oracle providing you with databases. You have other vendors who are providing you with networking equipment and networking expertise. And everything is really rigorously planned, costs a fortune, but it's executed and it has extremely high levels of reliability in terms of bringing the data from the meters to the utilities on-site servers. Now, nothing about that makes sense when you're talking about an environment in Haiti or in India or in lots of parts of sub-Saharan Africa, where the internet might be virtually non-existent. Might be edge cellular networks out in the rural areas, and where the availability of electricity is also intermittent. So the systems for AMI are not going to be able to be used in that instance. And that's where IoT and pushing out more of the intelligence of the system to the edge, right? These IoT devices themselves are quite smart. They have a lot of intelligence to them, right? That's what makes the Nest thermostat, or an Amazon Echo, one of their Alexa devices, or any of these sort of smart sensors that we're now putting into our homes. What makes them, the sort of characteristic that makes them these IoT devices is this idea of edge computing. We're putting a lot of intelligence on the device itself. So we took the approach that rather than putting the intelligence into the network or into what's on the server, to put the intelligence into the meters themselves, and then also into the device that the meters communicate to, which we are starting to call a grid edge management unit. And that grid edge management unit is really an energy IoT device that communicates locally with the meters over our wireless mesh network. And then it has a lot of intelligence. One of the things that it does, for example, is it caches all of the data that it's collecting from the meters. And it's caching that so that even if there's an interruption to the internet connection to go up to the cloud, that it can cache that data locally on the device for days, weeks, or even months at a time. And then when that internet connection is reestablished, it can populate the cloud database with the data that didn't make it up there, sort of the way that Dropbox might work on your computer to manage your files.
I'm smiling because it's all about batch processing.
Yeah, it's very much about batch processing. It's about the system being able to operate independently of the operator. And so with these AMI systems, the focus is really on the kind of human operator at the utility who might need to send a manual command to retrieve certain data from the meters. Whereas we are taking more of this approach of, well, we basically have unlimited database storage in the cloud. We have this very powerful edge computing device, our grid edge management unit. So let's just process everything independently and make the data available in the cloud whenever the user wants to do something with that data.
And the markets you mentioned, sub-Saharan Africa, India, they've leapfrogged the whole wires and they've gone directly to cell service, 3G, 4G, 5G. So I'm guessing you're able to leverage those rather than have to depend on traditional wire systems.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we're really agnostic to the internet backhaul. If there is an ISP, that's great. If it's cellular, that's fine. If it's satellite, that's fine. Maybe next year some of our customers will be on SpaceX's Starlink internet connection. So we really don't care about the internet connection. But I think you're absolutely right. The thing that we are leapfrogging is we're going straight to IoT, and we're kind of skipping this IT step, right? They're The benefit of our system is that there really isn't any traditional IT and networking that the utility needs to do. And that's because our meters with the grid edge management unit come with their own mesh network that's plug and play. So there's no configuration, there's no networking. The utility installs the meters, they install the management unit, they turn it on, and it immediately just starts communicating. And then the other big shift for the utility industry that we're pushing on is instead of having in-house servers and databases that you have to maintain and IT systems that are running those databases and are integrated with their other systems, it's all software as a service and it's all in the cloud. And it's super easy to just create new instances when necessary. It's super easy to use standard, well-documented APIs to get the data out and to put it into other systems. And that's much more of this IoT kind of approach instead of that traditional networking IT approach.
Now, you've made it sound very simple, but I know from being involved in tech, hardware is hard. How difficult was it to get to this point?
It was really difficult. We were also starting at a time several years ago when the cost of the smart metering hardware itself was still pretty expensive, when it wasn't unusual for a smart meter to be in the realm of $200 per unit. And so a really interesting evolution that we saw happen, and so as a result, was we designed our own smart meter from the bottom up to be a lower cost smart meter. And that's where we originally thought we were going to get a lot of our advantage, what was cost advantage compared to other smart meters on the market. And then a really interesting thing happened, which was that kind of suddenly companies in China began producing smart meters almost as like a commodity, where they really just kind of converged on a fairly common design across the manufacturers of a smart meter base that could then sort of plug into different communications modules. And so that's where around that time, not surprisingly, GE actually sold off its meter manufacturing business. And there were some other transactions in the space as well with companies that were making meters. And there was this sort of realization that you actually might not end up making money on selling the smart meter, because this cost pressure from China is pushing down the prices. And instead, the focus really became more on the services and the software. And so our evolution on the hardware side has really come full circle, where we are actually no longer manufacturing our own meter design or even our own communications module design. We've now completely really outsourced that to a Chinese company that makes smart meter bases at a much lower cost than we were able to. And then we're also working with a Korean company that manufactures radio modules. And so it's still all our software that's running on the radio module, but where we really went to these specialists in terms of the manufacturing, and we've now integrated with those hardware platforms. The grid edge management unit is a piece of hardware that we have designed and is where we do own that unit in terms of the design. We were originally had outsourced the base station while we were using our own in-house designed metering hardware. And so we've now switched. And the reason for that is because we do want something that's much more customized and streamlined and provides greater value. And we felt that we could do that by designing our own grid edge management unit instead of outsourcing that to off-the-shelf hardware.
And just for the benefit of those listening along, how long did it take you to go from prototype to production?
That was probably the first 2 years of the company's existence, was going from prototyping and R&D to when we were first able to sell our meters and have them used by a small number of customers.
And I'm really fascinated with the model, so I'm going to stay on this for a moment. You mentioned earlier partnering with vendors. Can you explain what a vendor that's selling the, I'm going to say power, what does that person look like? Or what does that organization look like?
So I think you're referring to our customers.
You said that the consumer goes and purchases it from a vendor. Is that correct?
Yeah, so our customer is a utility, and the way that they sell electricity to their end users is entirely up to them. A lot of utilities have vendors who are sort of this middleman between the utility and the end user, and it's that vendor that the end users are actually buying their electricity from. So in some cases, this might be a small shop in a rural village. In other cases, this might be a big company that has a franchise where that utility is giving the franchise rights to that company to sell electricity credits to the end users. And in other cases, it might be the utility itself, where the utility is directly receiving payments from its customers to provide them with electricity. So the point that I was making about our software platform is that we're really agnostic to the business model and the modes of payment that the utility, that particular utility, is using to receive payment from their customers.
And I'm asking because, again, it reminds me of back in London, there was a time where you could actually go to the post office or a local convenience store to pay an electric bill or a gas bill.
That's right. Yeah, and still for some of our customers, there is that middleman between the utility and the end users. And if that's the case, that's totally fine. Our system can accommodate that.
How does the utility benefit from the data it collects from the end users?
Yeah, I think this is where we certainly want to build capability at SparkMeter to deliver a lot more value to the utility outside of this domain of payments and metering and billing. And that's super important aspect of the utility's operations. I think it's where we've really focused the last few years. But the promise of smart metering is that the utility can leverage the data from the meters to say, oh, I have an outage on this part of my grid, right? And think about in the days when we didn't have smart meters that were communicating data, how would the utility find out about outages? It might be very manual. It might be their customers are calling them to tell them that they don't have an outage, or it might be that the utility has some real-time sensors on its network, but they have a way smaller number of those sensors at parts of their network that are much sort of higher up in the transmission distribution system, and they don't have a sensor in every single customer household. So if one of those sensors were saying, this part of the network doesn't have power, what does that mean? Or if all of those sensors are saying everything's good, we all have power, but the issue is further down the network, and there are some customers that don't have power, how does the utility find that out? And so that's where smart meters can essentially act as sensors and provide the utility with this data and this information, this context that has nothing to do with what we traditionally think of as belonging to the domain of metering for billing and payment. And so that's what we're really striving to do, is to take the data and to produce analytics that might tell the utility, you're based on these voltages, we're seeing this much voltage drop on this line. And when you have voltage drop on a line, there's actually a cost there. You're actually burning more electricity than what you would ideally want to be losing to losses. Or we might be able to tell the utility that based on the aggregated load from a particular transformer, that the load on that transformer is over the capacity of the transformer. And if you keep on loading your transformer this way, you might reduce the lifetime of that transformer by 5 years. And so you're going to have to replace it early, and that's more expensive for the utility. So there's all sorts of additional analytics that you can produce for the utility using that data. And I think that what we've seen happen in the United States with its experience with smart metering and AMI is that you don't necessarily get those benefits unless certain things are true. And to go off on sort of another tangent for a minute, I think what was really interesting about the experience with smart metering in the US is that the 2008 financial crisis resulted in the ARRA, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, And that authorized billions of dollars of grants under the DOE's Smart Grid Investment and Grant Program for utilities. And a lot of those grants were actually used to buy smart metering AMI systems. But those many of those utilities never went the step beyond just using smart meters for billing. And so we now are over 10 years later after those smart metering procurements, and these utilities still aren't using the data to go into outage management or managing their distribution systems or improving their planning processes. Because in many cases, they're not even pulling back data from the meters other than just the energy data, which is what you just need for a bill. You just need to know kilowatt hours. So they might not even be pulling back the voltage or the current or power quality data in some cases because they might not even have a database. And this is especially for these smaller utilities in the United States, of which there are many, where they, like utilities in developing countries that we're serving, they don't have a big IT department, or they can't afford to spend $1 million on Oracle or Accenture or Deloitte to come in and get them set up. And so there's been, I think, this real tragedy of AMI in the United States in that it hasn't really provided a lot of value to these utilities outside of billing. And that's, I think, something that we're looking to kind of fix. And we're looking to make sure that if you're a customer of ours and using our smart metering system, that we're providing you with software out of the box that's giving you additional value into these other operating areas of your utility.
It sounds like a huge opportunity.
Yeah, it definitely is. And we're having some really interesting conversations, even in the United States, about how we might be able to at least take the software part of what we've built and work with utilities, especially small utilities in the US. If you're a utility serving fewer than 250,000 customers, there are a lot of technology companies, vendors, especially these IT systems providers, that might not even be interested in working with you because you're too small. And that's because they're in the business of selling IT services contracts. Whereas we want to be in the business of selling on a software as a service, cloud platform basis to as many accounts as possible. And if that means going to small utilities that are serving fewer than 250,000 customers, but they've got smart meters installed, that looks like a great opportunity for us.
Indeed, it is. So, I want to get to the crux of our conversation. You mentioned a few things earlier. You mentioned your 8th grade science experiment. Then you also mentioned working in Haiti and now the work that you're doing in India, sub-Saharan Africa. I see a thread there. And what's the why? Like, how do these things come together?
I think where these things kind of come together is just kind of an interest in, certainly personally in my work having meaning. I think, and that's really a unifying characteristic of all of the people who work at SparkMeter. I think any one of us could go and work for a different company and probably get paid more. and for some people, that's the interest, is maybe working on a super challenging technical problem, or working somewhere where you have really high upside financially. And I think that what unifies the people at SparkMeter, and certainly for me personally, is that this is really about doing work that's going to have an impact in people's lives in an area that is definitely of great personal interest to me. You can have impact working on water or sanitation issues, or agriculture issues, or health issues. That's certainly true. I think for me personally, I just kind of have an intrinsic interest in energy, something I've been passionate about for a long time, and seeing energy as this enabler of opportunity, and energy really being, if I have access to clean, reliable electricity in particular, that means that I am going to be much more empowered and have many more opportunities as an individual on the planet than if I didn't. And so I think that there is that thread of viewing energy as this vehicle for delivering opportunity and freedom for people around the world.
Why is it important to you to have work with meaning?
I think that probably just came from my upbringing, and in particular from my mom. I remember from a pretty young age, my mom essentially teaching me about privilege, and that wasn't the hot word that it is today. But I have pretty distinct memories of my mom telling me things when I was like, 6 or 7, that I was lucky to have been born in the United States to a family where we really didn't have to worry about being hungry, and we didn't have to worry about having our necessities met, and where we had nice things and we could go on vacation. And that was not something that many people in the world did have. And so I think that was something that my mom really reinforced in me, and also where she kind of created an explicit sense of expectation that I could basically do anything I wanted to, as long as it helped people.
I love that it sounds like your mom was a lady way ahead of her time.
Yeah, I think she certainly is.
Well, you've been on this journey for a while now. What's the most valuable lesson you would say you've learned about yourself?
I think probably something having to do with resilience. We've gone through a lot of challenging and trying times. I've had a couple of my advisors say that at some point I should write a book about the experience, because of some of the things that we've had to go through. And I think that that's probably not foreign to founders and leaders of companies that are backed by venture capital and are trying to have an impact in their work, and that they aren't just building an app out of wherever, Silicon Valley or New York, and they're building an app as like something consumer facing for them to make a ton of money. That there's really this other motivating factor behind their work, and that can create some degree of tension when you do have that mission focus to your company, but you're also bringing in essentially venture capital. So I think that there's been certainly an interest from investors in financing impact, which is great, and our investors certainly view that as being part of their investment mandate. But I've certainly found that this isn't the easiest road to have taken, but that there's been some great learnings about myself in terms of where I can pull from to be resilient and to continue to lead the company through challenging times.
Well, speaking of leading the company, let's move into the future. It's 2030, magic wand. What does the future hold for SparkMeter?
Uh, so I think the if everything goes as in the kind of most optimistic development with energy access, 2030 is really the target for global universal access to electricity. So I think the hope is that by 2030, all of the roughly 1 billion people, I think that the number might be closer to 800 and 900 million people currently who don't have access to electricity whatsoever, that would not be the case in the next 9 to 10 years, and by 2030 there's universal access. I haven't stayed super current on the modeling efforts, but as of a few years ago, the expectation is that the most economical means of connecting the roughly 1 billion people who don't have electricity whatsoever to electricity would be kind of roughly divided equally between extending an existing grid, solar home systems, small-scale distributed solar home systems that provide a relatively small amount of electricity for basic needs like lighting, and then the remaining third through microgrids. And so if we take, let's say that would be 500 or 600 million people who would be connected either to a grid that gets extended or to a new microgrid, you're talking about something on the order of 100 million new grid connections over the next 10 years, right? 10 million connections per year. And we're hoping that about half of those, at least, will come from microgrids, which is really exciting. I reckon, and I don't have a great source for this, that there are probably about 1 million microgrid connections today. It's worth noting that SparkMeter, we've sold over 150,000 meters to date, mostly to the microgrid sector. So we have a very high market share today of existing microgrid connections. So my hope is that we go from 1 million connections today, where SparkMeter has a relatively high market share, to 100 million connections, maybe it's 50 million connections on microgrids in the next 10 years. So 50x market size increase. And if we can maintain our current levels of market share, where in 10 years, we have well over 5 or even 10 million of those microgrid connections are being served through SparkMeter systems. So I think that's one aspect of aspiration. The other one is in DERs, distributed energy resources, being used as virtual power plants for the grid. I think everybody in the US is pretty well aware and on the same page that for virtual power plants and DERs to be used in a coordinated way through DERMS platforms, distributed energy resource management system platforms, that we need to have a much smarter grid. Our hope is that our technology is what enables that smarter grid, especially at the edge of the grid, for utilities in emerging markets and developing countries. Smart meters should be the cornerstone of that. And I think that that's the system that we're building today. Is we provide utilities with the smart metering system, and then we use that data combined with information about the utility system to produce grid analytics. And then the grid analytics would help inform a strategy for DERs to potentially be used as virtual power plants at the grid edge, because the grid analytics would tell you exactly at what location, what amount, and at what price grid services from those distributed resources would provide value to the grid and to the customer. So I think that's the other in 10 years part of the equation, is that SparkMeter is not just selling meters, but we're doing really full utility digitalization through grid analytics and enabling new business models like virtual power plants.
Well, I look forward to seeing both of those aspirations come to fruition. Earlier in the conversation, when I asked you about things you learned on your journey, you mentioned tenacity, which is advice also. But last question is, if you could share some specific advice or words of wisdom with the audience, what would it be?
I think there's a lot. I think and the reason why there's a lot is maybe this sort of comes back to what's worked for me, which is surround yourself with great mentors and put yourself in a position of learning and acknowledging through humility how little you know and how much you could potentially learn from someone, or learn even in circumstances that might seem familiar, but maybe you're missing something. Maybe there's still something more that you can learn even from familiar circumstances. But I think that the most important thing is think about who your heroes are, if you have any heroes, whether any of those people could be your mentors, and pursue them. But really, I think it comes back to find mentors, find people who you look up to and who you believe have sort of values that you aspire to have, or have achieved things that you aspire to achieve, and see what you can learn from them.
I think the idea of going out and finding mentors, identifying mentors, is often overlooked. People get intimidated, but I appreciate that advice. I think more people should actively pursue, like you said, the people they admire, and see how they can become part of that. You mentioned group of people or tribe of people they can surround themselves with.
Yeah, exactly.
Dan, I really appreciate your time today, and I look forward to the continued success of SparkMeter and catching up with you again soon.
Sounds great. Thanks for taking the time.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you for listening. If you like our show, please give us a rating and review on iTunes. And you can show your support by sharing our show with a friend or reach out to us on social media, where you'll find us under our Nexus PMG handle. If there's a subject or topic you'd like to hear about, send me an email, btu@nexuspmg.com, or contact me via our website, nexuspmg.com. And while you're there, you can sign up for our monthly newsletter, where we share what we're reading and thinking about in the clean tech, green tech sectors. Bigger Than Us is a Nexus PMG production.